Let's talk about trade policy issues. So history, law, institutions. We've got to make some sense of all of this. All right, latest trade issues. What is going on? I gave a talk recently to a group of visiting officials from foreign countries through a State Department program, and my subtitle to current trade policy is like, what on earth is happening? Because there's new news every day, and this is the most dynamic period with changes in international trade policy in the U.S. that I have ever seen or read about, I think, in my entire life. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but we want to get to kind of what's gone on in the past and how did it lead up to where we are today. So I'm going to start with a couple of pointers. Number one is this notion of rising anti-globalization beliefs is something that is a tendency that I would say is growing stronger in the United States and in countries around the world. A lot of folks have become a little bit put off by this notion that globalization is going to raise all boats and make everybody better off, because there's been a lot of evidence that that has not necessarily been the case, that everyone has not been better off as a result of globalization, and that, in fact, maybe some segments of populations in different countries have been made absolutely worse off as a result of globalization. So there is this rising sentiment that what was proclaimed over the last 20 years or so, that free trade, open markets was going to be good, has not turned out to be, has not kind of lived up to expectations. Now, this is not a completely new sentiment, and if we go back even just about 20 or 25 years, there was a rising anti-globalization sentiment that began after the creation of the WTO, which was in 1995. And in fact, at the second ministerial meeting of the WTO in Seattle in 1999, there was this big wave of protests. Protesters came out, flooded the streets of Seattle where the ministerial meetings were being held, and were protesting that globalization, this openness with the world and free trade, was undermining the environment, and it was causing distress amongst workers, and it was causing the destruction of a lot of good things in the world. And that was a growing phenomenon back in the 1990s. But then it kind of dissipated a little bit, especially with the onset of the 9/11 tragedy in the United States and the Iraq War that followed it, the Afghanistan intervention and then the Iraq War, and the sort of the concerns about U.S. involvement abroad, and that sort of changed the dynamic and sort of settled the anti-globalization concerns, but they never really went away. And they've come back, I would say, much more strongly, and are certainly being affected and implemented to some degree by Trump and the new administration in the United States. Okay, now I'm going to walk back and I'm going to talk a little bit about other patterns of sort of globalization and protectionism trends that have occurred in the past, just to give you a longer historical perspective on that. We'll get to that in a few minutes. The Trump approach to trade is puzzling, to say the least, but he is suspicious of many things. Okay, so my listing here is suspicious of free trade agreements, and his regular comment is that, you know, all the free trade agreements that we've had in the past were poorly negotiated and have hurt America, and that we need to get rid of them, absolve ourselves of them, and we need to renegotiate them. Because every agreement that's been done in the past, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, which is called KORUS, and other free trade agreements are just taking advantage of the United States and hurting American workers in particular. So that seems to be Trump's view. Now, one of the big changes he did make coming in as president a few years ago is to withdraw from the TPP. TPP stands for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it was a free trade agreement that was negotiated between 12 different countries in the Pacific Rim. So it included the United States, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and a number of others. The United States already had free trade agreements with about 6 of them already. So it was adding on, the most important country it was adding into the fold was Japan. But I want to be a little bit careful in describing the TPP. So Trump was against it, but then so was Hillary Clinton, the opposition candidate in the 2016 election. She also came out against the TPP and said that she was likely to not push it forward if she became president as well. You know, she was a member of the Obama administration and was also sort of supportive of the TPP previously. So we might want to ask a little bit, like, what generated this opposition amongst the candidates and amongst the people that they were, trying to win support from to oppose the TPP? Now, first of all, it was a free trade agreement. It generated more globalization, more movement in that direction. And like I said, there's been this growing sentiment of sort of backlash against globalization that it's a problem. But, when I looked at the TPP and thought about it, is this something that's worthy of support or not, when it was in the heart of the discussion? I am an economist, and I will tell you up front that I generally support freer trade movements, and I think that's a good thing, and I'm going to tell you why. It's not 100%, it's not absolute. We're going to talk about lots of caveats and lots of problems associated with it. But I'm generally supportive of free trade. TPP is a free trade agreement, so therefore we ought to rally around and support that. I would tell you is a little bit reluctant to do that because the TPP was a different kind of agreement than a lot of previous agreements. And one of the things that happened with TPP is that it was negotiated largely undercover and without any kind of transparency about who was involved in the discussions, what was being included in it, and only kind of at the end was anybody allowed to see what the negotiations were all about. One of the reasons for that, perhaps, is kind of what was included in the TPP. And I want to highlight a couple of points about that. And I would describe the TPP agreement as kind of, it's not just a free trade agreement. It had two purposes, in a sense. It was a free trade agreement, and it was a multinational industry protection program or agreement. It was doing two things. It was helping promote freer trade amongst the countries, but it was also securing businesses that were dealing with across other countries. It was helping businesses who do international business. And it was helping them by giving them some power and control over even the policies that other countries might implement. So, for example, one of the aspects of the TPP was investor-state dispute settlement procedures that were incorporated. And this was to allow industries who invest abroad to have some protections against changes in policies that might affect their businesses going forward. So let's say I'm going to invest in a nuclear power plant in Malaysia, for example, and I'm going to pour a bunch of money, billions of dollars into this to help develop it. And then the Malaysian government comes out and says, well, we're going to restrict nuclear power and we're going to, change the rules and say you can't really do that, thereby negatively affecting the investment that this foreign entity has made in that particular business. Well, the investment state dispute process was a way in which businesses could kind of more strongly control and affect outcomes like that, and to try to prevent countries from changing the rules of the game that were going to affect or negatively impact their international business. All right? Now, that could work in a good way, or it could work in a kind of nefarious way where it really is big businesses kind of trying to control what independent states wish to do. And you can kind of come down on both sides of the question, but it is trying to give some control to businesses over their outcomes in foreign investments that they make. Now, another area that the TPP was heavily involved in is in the extension of intellectual property rights protections. So there's a lot of businesses doing things internationally. And one thing, that businesses like to do is to have monopoly privileges or power. One way they get those monopoly privileges and power is by patents, intellectual property rights over certain products that they produce and whatnot. But those patents have a limited lifetime. They last generally 20 years. But there have been ways in which, for example, pharmaceutical companies have gotten to kind of extend the patent life from 20 years to 25 years to 30 years by combining patents over other aspects of the pharmaceuticals and kind of extending them out over a longer period of time. And one thing the TPP was doing was trying to enable that process to be valid throughout the 12-country region. This was going to give U.S. pharmaceutical companies then kind of a longer protection for some of their products in a group of countries, and it was going to secure the monopoly privileges of these individual companies, which come at a loss to the consumers of these individual products, who thereby have to pay higher prices for them and whatnot. Now, monopoly protections and business protections are not necessarily generating the same kind of welfare gains, we'll see later, that free trade does. So free trade might be in the interests of, say, the average consumer in the countries involved, but the industry protection programs that are being put into place as a part of these agreements may not serve the interests of the general population as well. And that's why there's a lot of kind of discrepancy and kind of mixed support for what has been termed TPP, a 21st century trade agreement. So that's what the Obama administration labeled it, and they said this is like the gold standard for free trade agreements in the future. Well, it's worth noting that what the gold standard meant 2 years ago, 3 years ago, meant not just free trade, but also extended protections for big corporations in their international business. And again, without going into a lot of the details, we could spend an entire class or more talking about it perhaps, but there's pro and con to what the businesses were trying to achieve in these other aspects. But it's also a reason why there was little transparency in the negotiations, why big business didn't really want people to know exactly what was being negotiated and what was in these agreements, and why a lot of analysts, when TPP came out, I read a really good overview of the TPP by the Cato Institute here in D.C., and they're a libertarian-oriented, free trade, pro-free trade group in the U.S., and they came out and basically went down the agreement and said, well, this is good for free trade. We're in support of this. This is not so good for free markets and free trade. This is good. This is not so good. And they kind of showed you that from the perspective of kind of freer markets and trade, this agreement is not really giving you freer markets and trade across the board. So anyway, that's a little bit about what TPP was about. And it's also then what some of the newer discussions and negotiations about revising free trade agreements is also about. So the KORUS, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, was renegotiated and re-signed off last year. It didn't change very much. It had a little bit to do with extension of trade in automobiles and auto parts between the U.S. and Korea. And I don't think they really touched upon intellectual property rights too much, but those are the kinds of things that now get included in international trade negotiations to a degree. The NAFTA is the same way. It also didn't really change the NAFTA too much. Oh, and I should point out, the NAFTA was renegotiated under the Trump administration. He came in and said NAFTA is a terrible idea, but they renegotiated it and really just kind of changed it around the edges. They made some different changes in terms of domestic content laws for automobiles. It would affect auto trade to some degree, but largely the NAFTA remains intact, and there's not too much of a change in terms of the renegotiation of it. We'll point out that KORUS was renegotiated and implemented, but NAFTA needs to go to the Congress for approval, and it has not yet received congressional approval, so it's still has not been finalized. So although Trump renegotiated, got a signed off agreement, it has not yet been implemented because the U.S. Congress has not approved it. Let me talk about that just for a minute. And this is going to be an important point that will come up over and over again throughout the talk today. In the United States, the Constitution says that the U.S. Congress is the one that has the right to make trade policy. It's very clearly stated in Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution. The President has no control or ability to affect trade policy. The President is not given that by constitutional authority. The President does not make trade policy. But there is an exception. And the exception is the President can make trade policy and take actions when the Congress has given the President authority to do so. All right, now, one of the ways in which Congress has given the presidential authority in the past, and this has been a part of U.S. trade policy discussion for 25, 50 years or more is in the granting of what's called Trade Promotion Authority, TPA. It's also called Fast Track Authority. What the Congress did many years ago, I think beginning in the 1960s, but you can check me on this to be accurate, that the Congress said, all right, well, it could be beneficial for the U.S. to be able to go out, the president's arm or agency, which is the U.S. Trade Representative's Office right down the street here, that it could be useful for them to go out and negotiate free trade agreements or other types of trade agreements with other countries. But they don't have the authority to make trade policy, but they can negotiate an agreement. What Congress agreed to do is to say, if they do that, and they reach some sort of a deal with another country that would, say, promote free trade, they could then bring it back to the Congress, and Congress agreed to vote either yay or nay, up or down. Meaning that Congress wouldn't bring this agreement back and say, oh, well, that's great, but I don't like this clause, and I want to change that clause, and I'd rather this said this. And you know how Congress works where, a bill is passed or a bill is introduced, and then there's all sorts of amendments that people want to put on, and they want to change this, and they want to add that. Congress said, no, we're not going to do any of that. Bring a free trade agreement back to us. We'll either, we'll vote it up or we'll vote it down, and that's going to fast track this process. It's going to make it faster. And it's going to give the president more ability to negotiate freer trade agreements, for example, with the rest of the world. Now, fast track authority is something which the president has been granted over and over again since about 1960. But there have been a few periods of time when the president lost fast track authority. And the first time was just after Clinton became president, back in the early 1990s. Bill Clinton did not have fast track authority through most of his presidency. And it did not come back into play and did not get reinstated until 2002, when President Bush managed to get enough congressmen together to kind of reinstitute fast track authority and to put that into place. Now, after 2002, there was a big change in terms of free trade agreement negotiation by the United States. And in fact, after 2002, the U.S. passed free trade agreements with Australia, Singapore, Chile, Morocco, Bahrain, a bunch of others. So there was a surge of free trade agreements that were negotiated in the aughts, in the zeros of the 2000s. I don't know how to talk about that decade. The aughts, is that right? The zeros, the first decade of the century. A lot of free trade agreements because President Bush had fast track authority for 5 years, up until 2007. And then he lost it. And the Congress, wary about globalization, about free trade in general, as a rule, was not anxious to reauthorize free trade fast track authority, and it lingered. And it lingered until sort of the middle of the second term of Obama, when fast track authority was re-implemented again for a period of time. All right, so Obama got it back for a short period of time, and I'm actually not sure what the status of it is right now, because Trump is just kind of in his own world doing other things. But I highlight this story because I want to emphasize it because it's important to recognize that presidential authority over trade policy matters is still vested in the Congress. The Congress can give the president authority. The Congress can take authority away from the president too, presumably, if it so desires. So Trump is very suspicious of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And throughout this class and the next one, we're going to talk a lot more about the origins of the WTO, kind of what it consists of, and how it works. But Trump has been very suspicious of the WTO, doesn't really believe that it's helping or aiding U.S. interests, and for a number of reasons has sort of taken some actions that are undermining, for a lot of ways, are undermining the WTO agreement that countries have. And then lastly, Trump has been very suspicious of China, as have many politicians over the past decade or two. There's been a lot of concern about China because China is a rapidly growing economy, having a bigger and bigger footprint on international trade, and thereby affecting businesses and trade flows and production patterns around the world. So it is not surprising that China has influenced and affected a lot of businesses and thereby caused a lot of kind of uproar in trading patterns and therefore in trade policies as well. So Trump has come in very suspicious of China and, largely remarking on the large trade deficit that the U.S. has with China and indicating that this means, because it's $500 billion in size, that we're losing $500 billion to China every year. This is not at all true. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened with respect to China and to trade policy in general since Trump became president. So one of the things that Trump said when he first when he was running for president is that with respect to China, he said, when I become president, I'm going to raise tariffs to 45%. We're just going to, across the board, raise tariffs. What Trump didn't know, I think, at that time, and took a while for him to realize, is that once becoming president, he actually has no authority to raise tariffs to 45% instantaneously like that. He couldn't do that. And he was advised that, well, the president doesn't have the power to just raise tariffs like that. But, being creative, his underlings went out and found that there are some privileges that the president has been given with respect to trade policy, which had rarely been used in recent history, but which could be applied to raise tariffs against particular countries. Okay, so the first exception that Trump was able to apply and to use in raising tariffs against other countries was called the Section 232 of U.S. trade law from the Trade Act of 1974. And I think it extends before that as well. And it's the National Security Clause. It basically says that in the case of a national security emergency, the president is enabled to raise up tariffs and protect markets because of a national security threat from another country. So, the Trump administration launched an investigation on whether steel and aluminum imports could be considered to be a national security threat. Now, nobody really thinks that the small amount of steel imports which the U.S. has, which I think is only like in the neighborhood of 10 or 20% of our total steel usage in the U.S., those imports are a threat to national security. But I went through the governmental process, and this took about a year, a little bit more than a year since Trump became president, before they could come out and say, make a case and say, yes, steel and aluminum imports are threatening national security, and therefore the president has the right now to put tariffs into place. And so in March of 2018, a year ago, March, the Section 232 report was released, and Trump announced tariffs of 25% on steel imports, 10% on aluminum imports, charging that this was a threat to national security. Now, it generated an uproar amongst our trading partners because this was not directed at China. This was directed at steel exporters or importers to the U.S. And that was going to affect countries like the EU and Brazil and Canada and other trade partners that, did not consider or think that they were a threat in any way to national security of the United States. And certainly these products were not. So it defies logic in a lot of ways that, that these countries were being affected by high taxes at the border for products that were not realistically affecting national security. So for a bogus reason, tariffs were being put into place. Now, a number of countries immediately asked for exceptions to this and say, hey, we are your friends, not your enemies, and we shouldn't be affected by these tariffs. So the EU, Canada, China, the EU, Canada, Brazil, a couple other countries, Korea, got exceptions. Japan got exceptions, but they were temporary. They lasted until, I think, the end of May of 2018, and then the Trump administration said, well, all bets are off. Everyone's getting the tariffs. So they raised the tariffs up against a number of different countries. Now, there were some exceptions, and one exception was Korea. Korea was in the process of negotiating the revival of the KORUS, the free trade agreement. And what Korea did is they said, tell you what, if you don't put the tariffs on steel and aluminum against us, we'll limit our exports of steel to the United States to a certain set amount. This is what's called a voluntary export restraint, a limitation on exports of a product by agreement. Country just from pressure from another country says, tell you what, we'll limit how much we export to you. Voluntary export restraint, VER for short. Now, the thing about these is it's interesting to note that VERs were considered a problem, if you will, in the 1980s. And it was so much of a problem. It was a protectionist action, limiting trade. It was not something that was in violation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which reigned from 1948 until the WTO came into being in 1995. So you could do voluntary export restraints without violating your trade commitments in the previous regime. But when the WTO came into place in 1995, countries agreed no more voluntary export restraints. We're just going to not negotiate those anymore. So it's a part of the WTO agreement that we would not do these. But Korea offered, the U.S. accepted, and the WTO is not going to do anything about it unless somebody complains. And in this particular instance, in this kind of case, I think nobody's going to complain about it. And so it happens. But I want to emphasize that this is not in line with the WTO agreement, and it's one of the cases now where there's an exception that's been made with respect to the WTO agreement that the U.S. is a part of. Yeah.
Would another steel exporter have the standing to complain about that, and they just won't, for example? Or with a third party?
They might have standing, and it might be possible, but I'm not sure that it would be deemed worth trying. I don't think there's been a case brought on VERs before. It hasn't been ruled on. So I think it would be a dangerous action to take. What countries did do, though, is they objected to the Section 232 action of the United States. And they brought cases at the WTO against the U.S. and basically said that the use of national security as an argument here was not justified, and that the tariffs were unjustified and therefore violated the WTO agreement. Now, those have not been ruled on yet, and it's quite likely that the U.S. would win those cases, I think, because the WTO agreement has a very general clause in there that says that if countries want to raise up their tariffs or feel they need to for national security reasons, they're allowed to do so. So probably the WTO agreement would give the right, the green light, to a country doing something like this. Even if it's a bogus reason, even if there's no good, real good, convincing argument on the other side, it's hard to identify what national security means and how to interpret it. And so it may be that the U.S. is not really violating its agreement at the WTO by virtue of this particular action. Yeah. I don't even know if I can. Go ahead.
I think it was that, we had a lot of our military used steel, and some of our planes and stuff used imported steel. And so if Britain wanted to go to war with us, they could start secretly selling us bad steel. And then when they went to war, all of our helicopters would fall apart.
You see, that's an argument that I could read, and I have read some of the report before, and then I would forget it completely because it just doesn't stick. But it turns out to be, arguments could be made. You put a couple of lawyers on a particular project and say, can you justify this? And they're going to be able to justify it some way. And so it could be done, but it's not really, anything that anyone would really believe in the end. All right, so there is a loss of confidence and a loss of faith in this particular use of national security. And I would point out, national security has rarely been used by countries to defend an increase in tariffs, to violate their WTO or trade commitments before. So this is new, and it's outside the box, it's outside the norm. The U.S. has not used the national security exception, I think, in a very long time or in very limited circumstances for 25 or more years. So this is kind of this is a sea change in terms of justification for an increase in tariffs. Now, to take action against China and to raise tariffs to 45% was not going to be possible under the current law. But what they brought out of hiding, if you will, was an old trade law called Section 301. And Section 301 was basically a law written back in, I think, the 1970s again, and then revised in the 1980s. And it basically said that the U.S. could investigate other countries whose practices domestically were hindering U.S. exports to that country. So if something a foreign country was doing was making it difficult for the U.S. to export there, then we could bring them up on charges, so to speak, and we could potentially retaliate against them for these restrictive trade practices. Now, one area of special consideration in Section 301 is intellectual property rights protections. And so what could be used and what was concerning back in the 70s and 80s was violation of intellectual property rights, which made it very difficult for companies to go abroad, sell their products without getting their products stolen or resold or intellectual property protections violated by the foreign country. And that then reduced or affected their business abroad. So China was targeted for intellectual property violations and investigated under Section 301, again, throughout the year 2017, up until March of 2018 when the final report came out, around the same time as the Steele report. And China was found to be violating intellectual property protections, and that gave the Trump presidency, the Trump as president, the ability to then raise up retaliatory tariffs according to this particular law. So remember, Trump can raise tariffs because Trump is applying this law, which is given the president authority by the Congress in the past, so forth and so on. Now let's take a look, without going into the details of is China violating Section 301 or violating intellectual property rights protections or not. This was the justification that was used. So when Section 301 began to be implemented, it's worth noting that Section 301 has a history at the WTO. In fact, going back to the 1990s, late 1990s, the Europeans brought a case against the United States shortly after the WTO began and charged the U.S. with violating its WTO commitments because Section 301 was not in line with our promises that we made at the WTO. And basically, what happened in that case is WTO ruled that Section 301 was okay because the U.S. came out and said if we implemented Section 301, we would do it following WTO procedures. So whatever we agreed to in the WTO, we can still use Section 301, but we have to follow the procedures that we outlined in the WTO. Now, those procedures would require that the U.S. do the following to complain about China's intellectual property rights infringements. That they would first have to go to the WTO and complain about China. They would have to start up an investigation in a case at the WTO. They could not retaliate. The U.S. could not retaliate until a determination was made by a WTO decision panel. We'll walk through this process in a little bit. All right. Only if the WTO finds that the U.S. claims are correct, only then would the U.S. be able to put retaliatory tariffs against a country in violation of its intellectual property commitments. All right. Now, the U.S. did not follow that procedure. What the U.S. did is they did the investigation independently. They determined that China was violating intellectual property protections. They then simultaneously did the following. Actually, first, they brought a case against China at the WTO, and then immediately or shortly thereafter put tariffs against China for violation of those intellectual property protections. So they did not, U.S. did not follow the procedures that they had agreed to adhere to in the WTO. Now, China has raised a case against the United States saying the U.S. is violating its WTO commitments, but those are in process and will take a while to be decided upon. We'll come back and talk a little bit more details about the WTO process. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to show you something that highlights the tariffs. Now, this is kind of instructive to see what's happened with the tariffs against China because of Section 301 violations. Now, I want to point out that things are changing so fast that about 2 weeks ago I put the syllabus together for this class, and I posted an article by Chad Bone, who's at the Peterson Institute here, and he's also the one of the people with Sumaya Keynes at The Economist who does the podcast, which I've asked you to listen to. Anyway, he wrote a paper a couple of weeks ago for the Peterson Institute and talked about here's what's going on with China's tariffs. Then in the last 2 weeks, Trump has come out with more announcements about tariffs, and it led to revisions of the graphs that he had presented 2 weeks ago. So I posted another paper that he just posted a couple of days ago, which has the revision of the changes in tariffs, which are now projected both in place and projected for the future. 2 weeks ago is already old news, and we're on to new news now because of changes in announcements. So here's what I want you to focus on. First, 2017, a couple of years ago. Average tariffs against China coming in for goods coming into the United States was 3.1%. And that's the average tariff for the United States in general across the board. Because of tariffs implemented in 2018, average tariffs against Chinese goods coming into the U.S. rose up to 12.4%. Yeah.
When it says that like creating a tariff on $200 billion worth of goods,
Yeah.
what does that mean? I never really understood
Okay.
what that means.
Well, I mean, we're importing about $500 billion worth of goods from China every year. So 200 billion of those are having tariffs raised up, 10% tariff on 200 billion. Okay. So 10% tariffs were implemented on $200 billion worth of goods. So basically what they did is said, okay, these categories of goods, we're going to raise the tariffs up from low tariffs, maybe around 3%, and we're going to raise them all up to 10%. So $200 billion worth of goods are now going to have an extra 10% tax applied at the border when they come in. All right, so that's like a threefold increase in the tax you have to pay at the border. And one thing to keep in mind is think about, what taxes you might all be used to paying, like sales taxes. Sales tax in a state or in an area. What's the sales tax in D.C. actually? It's actually pretty substantial, I think. Maybe around 9 or 10% even. Is that the restaurant tax or is it just sales tax in general?
Sales tax.
Okay.
5.75.
Huh?
According to Google, it's 5.75.
5.75. See, you can get instant information like that. It's amazing. So I think it's restaurant tax. It might be up at 10%. So like 5% is what you pay as a consumer. You go in and buy a good. All right. So now the taxes are raised up to like 10%. That's not so much, but it's going to start to affect your decisions potentially, certainly as a producer. Now the other tariffs that are being put into place are setting up at 25%. That's, imagine you're a consumer. You walk in and everything you buy has an extra 25% charge on it. That's going to probably affect your behavior quite a bit because that's a considerable increase in cost. This baseline, I think, was a result of some anti-dumping actions and things like that raised up tariffs. This other tariff, the black lines. But then the Section 301 tariffs are the remainder here. And then I'm not sure the distinction between these two colors here. But anyway, we've got 10% tariffs on May 10th of 2019. 10% tariff on the 200 billion remained, but then they were raised to 25%. Okay, so a big substantial increase in the early part of the summer here in D.C. that raised average tariffs in total up to 18.3% against China. Now, on September 1st, we got tariffs going up against China again, 15%. So I think the 10% that was in place is now going to go up to 15%. That's going to raise average tariffs in total against China to 21%. There's going to be another increase listed here. I'm going to read it. You can read it yourself. Raising tariffs up to 22.1%. And then if all goes as planned, and you can never tell, by December 15th, average tariffs against China will have risen over the last year from 3% or so up to 24%. That is a considerable increase in taxes that have to be paid at the border and that do get channeled along and affects consumer prices for these individual items eventually. And we're going to talk about the effects of tariffs and how they're going to propagate and what the effects will be in the different countries later on when we work through the theory of that. All right, so a considerable increase in average tariffs against China. Now let me go here, and this is kind of interesting too. So in response to the U.S. tariffs that have been put against China, China has retaliated. Now China only imports about $200 billion or so, or maybe even less, from the United States each year. So they can't put tariffs on as much as we put tariffs on them because the trade flows are not equal in both directions. But China has retaliated by putting tariffs against the United States. And this is the average tariff that China has applied against the U.S. So going back to January 1st, 2018, average tariffs into China by U.S. producers would have been, 8%, right? Okay, as China has retaliated, starting over here, especially on July 6th of last year I think this is, raised up to 10.1%. And this is the increase in tariffs on average that is both been implemented and projected to be implemented by China against U.S. goods, rising all the way up in December to almost 26%. Okay, so U.S. producers exporting to China are now facing a much bigger tax as China retaliates against the U.S. Now, note this too. Average tariffs against other countries that China trades with were set at 8% back in 2018. But as China has raised up tariffs against the United States, they've responded by lowering their tariffs against other countries. Thereby, can't get as many goods from the U.S., prices are going to be higher, so they will import more from the rest of the world. And that's going to have an effect of kind of changing trading patterns, perhaps significantly, that could have a much longer-term impact on U.S. producers who are trying to export or have been exporting to the Chinese market.
But can they do that according to the GATT?
Absolutely. So there is nothing in the GATT WTO that says you can't lower your tariffs. You can do that as much as you want, as far as you want, perfectly fine. So they're not in violation by doing that. They are in violation in a sense of their retaliatory tariffs. So they're raising their tariffs against us because we raised them against them. The retaliatory tariffs are equally violating the WTO, but their argument would be, well, we're only doing it because you violated your WTO commitments, they claim. So in a sense, both countries, because they've raised up their tariffs against each other, could be held to be in violation of their WTO commitments right now. One last thing to look at from this paper. It's posted in the readings list, so you can read through it all if you so desire. So these are individual products, like auto parts. And on auto parts, average tariff into China back in 2018 was 20.7%, a much higher tariff on this particular product. But it's scheduled to rise up in December 15, 2019, up to 42.6%. So auto and auto part exports from the U.S. into the Chinese market, which probably isn't substantial in size, is nevertheless going to be taxed considerably. Here are some of the other products which kind of match the averages that are listed up above. But let me show you the one other which has been affected a lot, which is soybeans. And we've read a lot, you've probably seen some articles about soybean producers in the U.S. and how they've been affected by the trade war. Well, take a look. They quickly raised their tariffs from 3% on soybean exports to China up to 28%, and they're scheduled to go up again to 33% by December. So particular industries are being affected in a very big way. Soybean producers have not, I think in some months, have not exported anything to China anymore. And China is beginning to export from Latin America and other parts around the world for this particular product. As those supply chains occur, it could substitute away from U.S. producers. Even if the tariffs were removed tomorrow, it might take some time for the reestablishment of these trade links to take place. So U.S. industries might be affected for a good long time because of these particular tariffs. Question, yeah?
Yeah, how does the Trump administration decide exactly what industries they want to impose the hardest tariffs on as far as the Chinese products go? Is there something like strategic as far as going towards certain industries?
Yeah, I think they do it somewhat like that. So, they're going to be brought under a certain amount of political pressure by various interest groups who are going to argue that, don't raise the tariffs on this, or we need to, they're going to listen to that, and then either Commerce Department or the U.S. Trade Representative's Office are the ones who kind of sit down with the details and determine which of these industries are going to be affected. One thing that's happened with this trade war is that announcements about raising tariffs have come first, and then there have come later announcements as to which industries exactly are going to be affected in what way. There's also a process built into the U.S. system that says if a tariff is going to be implemented, you can ask for an exception. You can ask for the U.S. to basically exempt certain industries or certain companies from this rule. So a lot of companies have filed for exemptions and basically said, especially with the steel and aluminum tariffs, we don't want to have these affecting us. It's affecting our inputs into our production process. We need them to be reduced, and they will file for exceptions from certain countries for these products. And the Commerce Department is currently in the process of investigating and analyzing a lot of requests for exceptions by U.S. firms to try to get out of the tariffs that have been placed by the U.S. So there is that process, but it's a painstaking and it's a long process for those to.
Way of going about it, firstly deciding that you want to impose all these tariffs, and then afterwards deciding just exactly
right. Exactly. Yeah, everything is different than we've ever seen before.
I remember they held hearings in D.C. and the Chinese producers come in with their lawyers, and then the U.S. companies that are purchasing the Chinese products also come in to kind of file their documents to say like how important those are or how like non-threatening those products are.
Right. And how they make those decisions, it's got to be tough, and I don't know how they're doing it. It's a mixture of, I'm sure, economic information and political inputs that are affecting their decisions on those case-by-case bases. Yeah.
Just a side point, I've read a couple articles that said that the Chinese tariffs for their retaliation are focusing on areas which would impact Trump politically the most, as opposed to just retaliating in the same industry.
Absolutely, and that's the soybean effect, I think, is indicative of that, certainly. So, countries in retaliating here and in the WTO context are often very strategic in terms of which products they're trying to pick out, because they're trying to have the biggest kind of political impact, to kind of create the greatest distress amongst people who are likely to complain to the government to try to reverse things and get them back to the way they were. So they do think hard about how to do these. Okay, now let me move forward, and we're going to get into more general things now. I'm going to go back a couple of steps and just talk a little bit about different liberalization eras and different protectionism eras, and highlight the fact that the world has really gone through cycles in terms of its openness or closedness to international trade. And in terms of openness eras, you've got to go back to the writings of Adam Smith, who was a strong proponent of freer trade and against mercantilism that prevailed before, and David Ricardo with his construction of the theory and principle of comparative advantage, which we will highlight and talk about here in detail in this class. And then the complaint against the British Corn Laws, which were keeping out foreign agricultural goods into Britain. And the idea at that time by economists, by David Ricardo and others, was like, look, we've got to get rid of this protectionism. It's not helping Britain, it's hurting them. And the Corn Laws were repealed in the 1840s back in Britain. And from that period onward, throughout the end of the 19th century in Britain had largely free and open borders and trade with the rest of the world. So there was this openness of Britain that was the first country to really industrialize in the world and to extend its empire and its imperialism abroad and to develop trade links between the regions which it was occupying and things like that. And that openness of trade sort of was inspired and certainly promoted by the British Empire in its early stages. Now, in those early stages, the United States was not as open. The U.S. was a more infant industrializing country at the time, and it had relatively high levels of protection that we're going to see in just a minute. But Britain was open. The second era of really openness took place before World War I. And if you read some of the literature and the books about economic flows prior to World War I, a lot of folks remarked upon how products in Britain, for example, or in other parts of the world, were sourced everywhere. Like things were coming in from China and from from India and from Africa and from parts of South and North America. And things were flowing in a huge way. And as the world began to globalize, back in the 1990s and into the 2000s, some people kind of looked back and said, is this the most open, most global economy we've ever had in the world? And the answer sometimes came back, depending on how you measure it, no, that the world was actually more open. There was more trade per person and so forth back in the early part of the 20th century than there was in the latter part. That it was really an open time prior to World War I, and then World War I happened. And that kind of changed things for a short time. Trade flows shut up, but they opened up again prior to the Great Depression era where things changed again in a big way. Now, there's another openness period that started to happen after World War II, but it was a much more slower and gradual openness. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was implemented in 1948, and it was an agreement to lower tariffs amongst the member countries at the time. And that lowering of tariffs took place piecemeal. Each round of negotiation, of which there were 8, took place over the course of several decades. And through those negotiations, average tariffs came down considerably amongst the member countries of the GATT. So the post-World War II, that phenomenon, the Asian tiger countries that opened up to trade and expanded, like South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and others that really expanded their economies and improved their standards of living dramatically through openness, occurred in the post-World War II period. Just around the time of the Uruguay round that created the WTO in 1995, just prior to that, a lot of countries kind of following the slowdown in economic activity of the 70s and the debt crises that occurred for developing countries in the early 80s, there was this kind of resurgence of globalization that took place starting about the mid-1980s and extending, I would say, up until the financial crisis or so of 2008. So we've had these periods where there's been this motivation, this drive for openness and for more globalization. But there have been periods of time of high protectionism in the midst of all of this as well. So I want to take a look real quick at, I'll go to this wiki page, see if this works. It does. And on this wiki page, if you come down to this graph, let's do this one. Here's an illustration of a little bit about what I was talking about before. So it's got average tariff rates. I don't know how they're measuring these average tariffs, and there's a couple of different ways to do so. Let me point that out now real quick. Two basic ways to measure average tariffs. Number one is called a simple average. And the simple average is you take all of the tariff categories that you've got. So I've got shoes, and I've got T-shirts, and I've got pants, and I've got sinks, and I've got all these different categories of goods, and each one of these products might well have a different tariff rate on it. So it's important to recognize first, many different products, what countries have generally done is to put different taxes or tariffs on each one of those products. How do you then measure the average tariff? The best circumstance is if you're a country like Chile. Chile has an average tariff of 6%. And the reason is because everything is taxed at 6%. It's very, very simple. Not different categories, but everything's 6%. We don't do that. Most countries don't do that. We have a different tariff rate on every good. So that means you've got to calculate the average to know kind of what is the level of protection in the country. Okay, simple average. Take all of the categories, add up all the tariff rates, divide by the number of categories, you've got an average tariff. There's two ways to do this, and I've realized I don't always know when I'm reading the data whether they're measuring the average tariff on only the ones that have positive tariffs on them, meaning they're getting rid of all the zeros, or whether they're including all the ones with zeros as well. If they say percentage tax on dutiable imports, dutiable means they have duties on them. They have a tax on them. And so therefore, you're just measuring the average on the taxed items, and you're eliminating all the zeros. If it's just average simple tariff across, then it might not be, and I'm not sure how they do it. So be aware there could be a difference there. The other way to measure the average tariff is to note that, we may not care about a good that has a high tariff rate for a product that we really don't trade in. All right, we might want to measure the size or the importance of the tariff by the level of trade that we have in that particular good. All right, so that's called a trade-weighted average tariff. We're going to weight the tariff in that category by how much trade takes place in that. We're going to calculate the average using those weights. Now, there's a real easy way to calculate the trade-weighted average tariff, and that is you take the tariff revenue that's been collected, and you just divide it by the total amount or total value of imports. And that's going to give you the trade-weighted average tariff. Now, there's a problem with that one, though, because if we're trying to measure like how protectionist, how restrictive is a country in letting goods come into its country? You might say, well, the trade weighted is a better way to go, except for one thing. The more you raise the tariff, the less trade will be. So maybe you've got a product where trade doesn't seem very important because we don't trade very much, but maybe that's because the tariff is high. In a trade weighted average tariff, you're going to put very little significance into that high tariff on this product which has been restricted because of the tariff. There's no perfect way to measure an average tariff. Both of these methods have their shortcomings, and you should just realize that there are different ways of doing it. It's one of the reasons why, and I can maybe show you a graph here in a second, why you can get different numbers that seem to be measuring the same thing. And they are, but they're not quite measuring the same things. I'll get to that in a minute. All right, so here are average tariffs in the U.S., which is this line here, versus Britain and France going all the way back to the 1830s. And notice, average tariffs in the U.S. back in the early 1800s as high as 50%. Now, you've got some comparison now that you can make. The tariffs we're implementing against China rising up to almost 25%. All right, these were up as high as 50% back in the 1800s. And again, 1860-70, right here, high tariffs in the United States. Tariffs in the 30%, 20% range throughout the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Then a big drop prior and into World War I, followed by a big spike upward in the 1930s because of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 at the onset of the Great Depression. All right, so high protectionism, free trade opening between the early part of the 1900s up until the Great Depression, big increase in tariffs because of the Depression in the U.S., followed by a drop in average tariff rates in the U.S. all the way down to this minuscule 2 to 3% that exists today. And notice, Britain and France, kind of the same, low protectionism, low tariffs during the late 19th century. Big increase for both of them in the Great Depression era, followed by a decline down to minuscule levels at the late part of the 20th century. All right, so it is important, and one of the reasons I want to show you these things is because it's always, I think, critical to have some perspective on things. When I showed you that graph before and said tariffs have risen from 3 to 25%, your perspective only is, okay, they used to be 3%, now it's 24%, that's a pretty big increase. But you have no idea, unless we look at other data, whether 24% is a high tariff, a low tariff, how does that compare to other countries? It's useful to know how these compare across countries. And so we're going to do a little bit of that in the next few minutes or so. We're going to look more carefully at some of the data and see how things look. All right, the point of this graph is to show, though, that there are different periods of time. Some periods where tariffs have been low, some periods of time where tariffs have been high, and it varies across countries as well. There you go, total imports and dutiable imports. So average tariff rates in the U.S. measured against total imports, that's the blue line, and then the tariff measured averaged only on the dutiable imports. Okay, so if you just measure the ones that have duties on them, the average, what is this of those that have taxes on them? And notice at the Great Depression era time here, you get a very big discrepancy between these two numbers. So the average tariff against all imports measured this way is about 20% at the height of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. But measured against dutiable imports, it turns out to be 60%. And this is something which is worth noting, if only that you've got to be really careful when you're reading data and trying to interpret it. Because there are a lot of things that you would think ought to be simple and straightforward, like what's the average tariff rate? And what I've just suggested to you now is that there's multiple ways to measure it, and each way you measure that is going to give you a different number. So if you're doing that and then comparing across countries, or you're comparing a country across time periods, you're picking data from different sources, you've got to be really careful to look and try to learn what exactly are they measuring and reporting in that particular data stream. Now, if you learn some of the details from some other data streams like this, you'll get a better sense of when you look at something, oh, that's probably measured this way or that's probably measured that way. But most people don't know to even ask the question about how things are measured, and they just kind of take it at face value. That means you can create an impression like, how high were the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930? And you can say, they were high, 60% compared to 24% today. But that's measured in a way looking only at the things that had tariffs on them, not the ones with zero tariffs. You measure it a different way, it looks much different in terms of its effect. And that's true in this data, and it's true in just about every other data that you look at. And that makes it difficult to keep up with and interpret appropriately. So I want you to just warn you of that. It will come up many times in your futures, I'm sure. So I talked about Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And one reason for putting tariffs into place is to try to protect your domestic firms. That's why we call it protection, and to help generate and keep jobs in those particular industries. So during the Great Depression, one thing that was happening was that as the economy slipped into the Depression, growth fell dramatically. That's what a depression is. And as a result, unemployment began to rise dramatically. When the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was put into place in 1930 in the U.S., it raised tariffs up pretty substantially. The intention, I think, in part, was to try to forestall the rise in unemployment, to stop it. Now, the logic is pretty simple. If you put tariffs at the border and you keep foreign goods out, then your domestic citizens are going to be forced now not to buy those foreign products, but to buy them domestically instead. So they're going to substitute away from foreign products towards domestic products. That's going to maintain demand for your domestic products and industries, and it's going to help secure the jobs of those particular workers. And so that's the logic that everybody falls into and says, oh yeah, got to protect our firms, got to protect our employment, got to keep jobs here. And so the U.S. put the Smoot-Hawley tariff into place. It's worth pointing out that it wasn't predicated, that Smoot-Hawley tariff wasn't coming and wasn't there because of the Depression. In fact, they started talking about Smoot-Hawley tariffs and raising them up back around 1928 or so, before the Great Depression ever came on. But it didn't get implemented until 1930. And one of the reasons for its kind of pushing through and coming about was because of the onset of the Depression that was happening then. The unemployment rate was about 8% when Smoot-Hawley was implemented. 3 years later, in 1933, we got to the peak unemployment of the Depression. And that was about 24%, 25% of the workforce in the U.S. economy. Output continued to drop dramatically. The point to be made is we didn't really achieve an increase in employment and save the jobs because of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. One good reason for that may well have been because other countries did the same thing. So even though we kept out foreign goods for a time through the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, other countries did the same. So our exporters were suffering, we lost jobs there, and the entire world economy kind of collapsed into a depression, much like we had never seen before in the 1930s. It was very severe, big drops in output around the world, and big increases of unemployment that last almost a decade. Now, a couple of things happened, and one thing I want to point out that is something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, called the RTAA. The RTAA was implemented in 1934 under the new Roosevelt administration. And it was about that time that everyone pretty well recognized that they weren't going to solve the Depression by protecting the economy. And instead, it would be better to move back in the direction of openness to trade, to try to stimulate growth through exports and through trade. But in order to do that, they realized they couldn't just lower their tariffs and expect, that would just bring imports in and kind of hurt. So instead, you got to try to promote exports. The way to do that is to go talk to your neighbors, your trading partners potentially, Britain, Mexico, Canada, others, and say, tell you what, your tariffs are high, our tariffs are high. Tell you what, how about if you lower your tariffs, not to zero, just somewhat on average. We'll lower our tariffs somewhat, and then we'll lock them in, and we'll trade more freely with each other. Okay, so that's what the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was designed to do, and it was important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was one of the early instances where the Congress gave the president the authority to negotiate trade policies. So the Congress said, President, your agents go out and negotiate bilateral agreements with other countries. And they did. And about 60 of these were signed over the course of the next 10 years or more. The second thing that's important for is that it was a predecessor to the GATT. Because when the World War II conference at Bretton Woods took place in 1944, they were trying to conceive of what institutions would be necessary in order to prevent a recurrence of the Great Depression after World War II, because there was a real big fear that after World War II ended, all the countries were just going to fall right back into the severe depression that they were in before. And they wanted to figure out how to kind of prevent that. And one way in which they thought to prevent that was to promote more open trade amongst the major countries, allied countries in the world. All right, so as a part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, they agreed to negotiate an international trade organization. And as a part of that was going to be this general agreement on tariffs and trade. That was a component of the ITO. But the ITO had a whole bunch of other stuff in it. And it was so much other stuff and thought to be so much imposing on the sovereignty of individual countries like the United States that the U.S. refused to sign on to it. And so the ITO never came into being. But the U.S. was willing and anxious to push forward the GATT. So the GATT came about in 1948, promoted by the U.S. and the U.K. prominently, but with about 48 other countries that signed on to it at the time. What the GATT did is to say, okay, instead of just two countries negotiating side by side, let's get a whole group of countries together into the room at the same time, and we'll all offer to lower our barriers to trade, not to zero, but just average tariffs will come down differently on different products. So some will liberalize a lot, some we won't liberalize as much, depending on our domestic concerns. And we'll lower our tariffs and we'll lock them in. We will bind the tariffs, they're called, bound tariffs at the gap. So we will set a maximum tariff rate that we will not go above. Lower them below that, fine, but don't go above the bound rate that you committed to. Now, the important thing about the GATT and the WTO before it is that the thing about the GATT is you've got to remember that it's an agreement which consists of promises that countries are making to each other. So what countries are really doing is saying, tell you what, we're going to revise our tariff schedule. We're going to lower our tariff bounds. We're going to put maximum tariff rates on all of these different products at these levels. And if we do that, what are you going to do for us? And the other countries will say, tell you what, if you do that, we're going to lower our tariffs to this combination of tariff rates. What do you think of that? So every country is coming to the GATT and saying, if we do this, what will you do for us? Every country agrees, okay, we'll do this, we'll do that. And when everybody agrees, okay, I like what you're giving us, I like what you're giving us, I like what you're, and this is what we're giving you, when everybody agrees, you sign off on the round and send it back to your legislatures and say, okay, now let's implement this. Let's put these trade policies into place because this is what we agreed, this is what we promised other countries that we would do. All right? Now, that's an important element about understanding the GATT and the WTO, because a lot of people think that the WTO, especially today, and the GATT before it, was like this institution in Geneva, which they are, that controls what countries' trade policies will be, which they don't. Countries' trade policies are based on what the countries have indeed promised that they would do for other countries. So the GATT and the WTO consists of promises to each other that countries can either live up to or not live up to, and we've got examples of both of that taking place. Yeah.
For those, like that original agreement, when it got sent back to each legislature, if one legislature said no, would it just move forward without that one country, or would it just all cancel?
Yeah, the GATT is an agreement which has to take place by consensus, so everybody's got to agree to it or it doesn't happen. And what's often happened in GATT rounds is if you have a country or a group of countries that just won't agree, then you just keep extending the timeline and you keep negotiating. So you kind of keep going until you get everybody to agree. That's the way it's worked in the past. And there hasn't really been a case I know of that a country has kind of gotten somewhere and said, well, we're just not going to go along and we're not going to be a part. So in the end, the GATT has worked by consensus. So nothing is agreed. The statement is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And that's the process of the GATT. So not until everybody is okay with it do they finally go forward and sign off on a round and go forward. All right, now what I was talking about here, and I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself, is, and I'll come back to the GATT a little bit more, but let me finish up on this slide. I'm talking about protectionism eras now. So Great Depression, big increase in protection, followed by the GATT, which took place in 1948 and start to bring average tariffs and trade barriers down. But there were a lot of relapses, I would call them GATT relapses, during the periods of the GATT from 1948 until 1995. And some of those are listed here with some acronyms. VERs, I talked about them earlier. So especially starting with VERs on textile and apparel products in the 1950s. So in the mid-1950s, U.S. textile manufacturers started to get hit with a lot of imports from this fledgling country called Japan. Japan was starting to export a huge amount of textiles and apparel products, and it was affecting business in the U.S. and in Europe. So what the U.S. did is they went abroad, and after World War II, went to Japan and said, hey, you ought to export less to us. That would help us out a lot. And Japan said, okay, we'll export less. So they did. And then, we'd find, okay, well, we solved that problem. Japan is limiting their exports to a certain amount. And then we'd find, oh my gosh, we got all these exports of textile and apparel products coming in from Hong Kong now. What are we going to do? Well, we'll go to Hong Kong and we'll negotiate a voluntary export restraint with them. So they'll limit how much. And then you got a bunch coming in from Taiwan. So every time you try to close the gap and try to prevent the flow coming in to protect your domestic market, it just springs up somewhere else. And then you discover that it's not just like cotton products that are being affected. Suddenly now wool products are coming in from other countries. So you've got to negotiate VERs with them. And then you've got synthetic products, polyesters, which were developed in the 1960s that started to be turned into apparel. And then that's being exported. And that's affecting our polyester producers. And it's like, so we're going to put limits on that. So we started to negotiate all these VERs, and so did the Europeans at the same time, until by the early 1970s, they said, there's enough, we got to do something about this. So they sat down and they formulated what was called the MFA, the Multi-Fiber Agreement. Now, the Multi-Fiber Agreement was kind of like a complicated grid of voluntary export restraints. So what it basically said is like, okay, let's put along the top column, let's put all the importing countries. Column over here on the left-hand side, we're going to put all the exporting countries, exporters, importers. And then from every exporting country to every importing country, for every product that's in the textile and apparel category, we're going to put a limit. We're going to say, okay, Hong Kong, you can export so many cotton T-shirts to the United States market every year. You can export so many to Germany every year. You can export, and then we'll put numbers in there, and we'll fill up this grid, and then everybody will know what you're allowed to do and how much trade can flow. So that's kind of the notion of the multi-fiber agreement. It is managing trade in a big way, and it's keeping trade from flowing freely and from changing. A lot of rules have to go into place to make this operation work, and it's got a lot of rents that are created, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. But it's protectionist. It's not really in the spirit of the GATT, and it's not in the spirit of opening up. So VERs led to the MFA in textiles and apparel, but VERs began to be negotiated in a whole bunch of other areas too. Automobiles against Japan in the 1980s, like in footwear products against other countries in the 1980s, and on and on. The Europeans and the U.S., whenever they couldn't solve a trade problem and they couldn't raise their tariff because they were bound by their commitment to the GATT, they would negotiate a VER instead. So the VER became kind of a safety valve, if you will, that allowed for increasing protection without violating to the letter of the law the commitments that countries had made at the GATT. And that's why it represented an exception that needed to be solved later. Yeah.
Would the exporting companies be allowed to lobby on their behalf on these VER things? Is it just the big governments?
It's against governments, and what we're going to see later is that it actually works to the advantage of the companies. So we're going to find that actually the reason why other countries agree to these VERs is because it's actually good for them. And we'll think about the implications of that a little bit later. All right, so this was a period. A lot of things like that kind of took place during the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that free trade wasn't really prevailing. Oh, the last one I got listed there is agriculture. So agriculture never really got onto the freer trade bandwagon like other products. So while we negotiated multiple rounds of the GATT during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s and onward, and as average tariffs came down, agricultural tariffs pretty much stayed at the same level. We just didn't live, because countries would go, okay, we'll lower our tariffs, but on agriculture, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep the tariffs up high. We're not going to bind ourselves to lower tariffs because we want to protect our domestic producers of agricultural goods. So that was something where free trade just didn't really take on in a certain sense. So there were a lot of hesitations to freer trade, despite the liberalization that was taking place as a result of the GATT. Now, post-2008 financial crisis, and the current period that we're in is also demonstrating a kind of a resurgence of protectionism, I would say. Post-2008 financial crisis would have been, a lot of economies fell into recession. U.S. unemployment rose to over 10%. This was a time when protectionism could have come back strong and powerfully in many countries around the world. It didn't really. It did in a little degrees. Here and there were instances. But it didn't really resurge like you might have expected. And I think one of the reasons why that occurred was because of the presence of the WTO agreement at the time. Countries would have been violating their commitments. Today, all bets are off because countries are starting to violate their WTO commitments left and right, led by the United States. And this is beginning to then undermine the confidence in that system and its prospects for the future. The GATT also, there were about 8 rounds of negotiation. Each round is basically set off when countries in the group say, hey, let's get together again. Let's have a series of discussions extending out over a couple of years maybe. And let's try to set new goals on sort of liberalizing our trade to a greater extent than what we had agreed to previously. So one thing that the GATT set up was tried to set up this momentum to liberalize trade. It wasn't trying to get to free trade immediately. It was just trying to move in that direction slowly and multilaterally, meaning all of the countries together would be simultaneously lowering their barriers on lots of different goods all at the same time. So what they did is they ended up negotiating 8 rounds of negotiation on the GATT. In each of those rounds, average tariffs came down a little bit. The other thing that took place, kind of simultaneously to the GATT, but not until the latter period, is regional free trade agreements. Sorry, I skipped over the middle one. So the last round of negotiation that was finalized in the GATT was the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round began in 1985. It completed in 1994. And it created the WTO that began in 1995. So the WTO is an offshoot of the GATT, and the GATT is included as a part of the WTO. But the WTO went further, and I think I've got a slide that's going to illustrate this in a second or so, by introducing a bunch of new trade issues into the mix, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the other thing that happened was countries began to liberalize trade along the route of forming free trade agreements. Now, a free trade agreement is different from the WTO. WTO is not a free trade agreement. It's freer trade, moving in that direction. A free trade agreement is when 2 countries or more get together and say, tell you what, we're going to lower all of our barriers to trade to 0. We're going to have free trade prevail between us. So you can move your products from country A to country B and pay no tax at the border and have no impediments whatsoever. Now, I'll point out that in free trade agreements, countries don't really agree to all of that, because there's always some domestic interests that say, hey, we can't really change this completely and have complete free trade. Really? Are you really serious? And so they say, okay, we're going to have mostly free trade, but in some of these industries and in some of these regulations, we're going to continue to have certain restrictions. So free trade agreements are mostly free trade, but not 100%. And to give you a good example, the U.S. has negotiated a lot of free trade areas, one is which, like the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And one thing that was concerning to a U.S. industry concern was that a lot of producers in the CAFTA countries produce this product called sugar. And sugar would have a big effect upon our domestic sugar producers here in the U.S. If we allowed free trade with that, well, that would just wipe out our U.S. sugar industry. So we have free trade with Central American countries, but in sugar, still restrictions. And that's an example of how not everything gets included into the free trade agreement. As of a couple of years ago or so, there were 279 regional trade agreements, RTAs, in place. And just about every WTO member has a free trade agreement. So this is cool. The WTO has a lot of cool information available to it, and a lot of it they put in map form. So this is their map showing the participation in regional trade agreements. And if you want to get a sense of what a country is doing, all you have to do is to come to this and click on a country, like the United States. And then all these little dots represent all of the countries with whom the United States has an active free trade agreement in place. So you see Australia, South Korea here, this is Singapore, a number of Middle Eastern countries, which are there not really because we trade a lot with them, but for strategic political reasons, I think. Latin American countries, the CAFTA countries here, Chile down here, and so forth. Take a look at another country like Brazil. Look, Brazil has got lots of free trade agreements with a lot of different countries, a lot concentrated in the Asia-Pacific region here. Let's take a look at China. China's agreements. One country that has a lot worth noting is Chile.
Did Brazil have like a trade relationship with North Korea?
You had North Korea, Brazil? Good question. They must. If it's on the data set, it must be true. I don't know what they're doing with that. Chile. Look at Chile. Chile is like the most active country in terms of participating and getting free trade. I think, yeah, look at that. Chile's got free trade with almost everybody.
Can you click on North Korea?
North Korea. Really? Wow, North Korea is more active than I thought. That says chorus. I don't know. I hadn't looked at that before. Curious. Comment? Yeah.
I was going to ask, are these free trade agreements or regional trade agreements, are they subject to WTO jurisdiction? Like, does your WTO have like a law for free trade?
Yeah, so the WTO basically says, and we'll talk about this principle a little bit more. They have a principle called most favored nation. And most favored nation says that the best trade policy you offer to others, you have to offer to every other WTO member country. All right, so you have to treat everybody non-discriminately, no discrimination against countries. Now, a free trade agreement means you've lowered your tariffs to zero with respect to a few trading partners. All right, and that would subject you under the GATT WTO to lower your tariffs to zero to everybody. But the GATT originally, back in the 40s, said, all right, well, we recognize that that might be an exception, and we will allow free trade agreements to go forward because it's in the spirit of the GATT. It's lowering trade to zero. And so we'll support that without requiring countries to obligate themselves to lower their. So you can violate MFN in that particular instance because it's allowable by the GATT on the WTO. The only thing you have to do is you have to notify the WTO. You have to let the WTO know that you're doing this. And that's why there's 279 notifications to the WTO saying we've decided to have a free trade agreement. Now keep in mind, these free trade agreements are not instantaneous. When they get implemented, it doesn't mean tariffs go to zero tomorrow. Oftentimes, they're implemented over a long period of time, stretching out as much as 15, 20 years or even more. Sometimes they're more successful. Some are more successful than others. They really do get to free trade. A lot of the U.S. ones have gotten to free trade on most products. Some of them are not so successful. They don't really get to free trade even after a long period of time. I think Mercosur amongst Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay has not been as successful getting to free trade, over a very long period of time. So there's a lot of differences across these different free trade agreements. But they're there, and it represents another kind of step in the direction of trade liberalization that has occurred around the world. Okay, so thank you for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Enjoy the weekend.